Sarah Brennan had lived most of her adult life in quiet corners and dim lighting. At 37, she worked as a waitress in one of Greenville's most elegant restaurants, the Glass Room. Located on the town's quaint main street, it was a place where the elite dined behind glass walls and where chandeliers hung like frozen raindrops from the ceiling. Sarah wasn't part of their world. She moved in silence. Her steps measured, her expressions warm but reserved. Her life was about service stability and showing up even when the world hadn't always shown up for her. Each evening, after long shifts filled with polishing glasses and enduring wealthy whims, Sarah would step outside into the night air. And there, without fail, sat her daughter Emily. 14 years old, always with an old violin case pressed close to her side, legs crossed on the bench across the street. She never complained. She never asked how long it would take. She simply waited, sometimes practicing quietly, other times simply listening to the faint music drifting from inside the restaurant. That was their rhythm, mother and daughter tied together by routine and something far deeper than words. Emily wasn't like most teenagers. She didn't chase trends or attention. She lived in her own world, built around music and quiet observation. Her violin, weathered and slightly out of tune, seemed more like a companion than an object. The varnish had faded in places, the strings often needed replacing, but to her it was a lifeline. What others might call a hobby, Emily treated like a sacred language, one she hadn't learned from a teacher, but from something much more personal. Sarah rarely talked about her past. She didn't speak of music dreams or the life she almost had, but inside her lived the echo of a former self. Before Greenville, before motherhood, before the long shifts and hushed tones, she was a promising student at the Manhattan School of Music. She had talent, undeniable and raw. Professors saw it. She saw it. But talent doesn't always survive life's storms. A year can change everything. An unexpected pregnancy, silence from her family, the quiet disappearance of a mentor she once trusted. Sarah had returned to Greenville not with plans, but with necessity. She found a job, raised her daughter, and buried her dreams in the back of a closet along with an old violin she swore she'd never touch again. Life didn't offer her music anymore. It offered bills, exhaustion, and survival. Still, every night when she saw Emily across the street, calm, centered, patient, Sarah felt something stir. She recognized the way Emily held that violin. Not with ambition, but with love. That's when Sarah began to realize music hadn't vanished from her life. It had simply found a new voice. Years ago, Sarah had believed that music would be her future. At 19, she walked the halls of the Manhattan School of Music with purpose in her stride and symphonies in her head. She practiced 8 to 10 hours a day, losing herself in sonatas and concertos. Her instructors often whispered about her potential. They believed she could go far, and for a while she did, until life interrupted with a different composition. The pregnancy wasn't planned. It wasn't even discussed. When she told the father, a fellow student, he went quiet. Days later, he was gone. Her parents, shocked and ashamed, offered no support. She was left alone with a decision that would change everything. She chose to keep the baby. She chose Greenville, and she chose silence. The violin went back into its case. Her future, once filled with music, now became about survival and motherhood. For years, she never mentioned any of it to Emily, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. How do you explain that a dream can disappear, not with a crash, but with a whisper, that a life can change course, not by choice, but by necessity? So Sarah worked, and Emily grew. The violin stayed hidden, collecting dust in a forgotten closet. Until one day, when Emily was 8, she found it. She brought it to her mother without a word, eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah held the instrument like a ghost from her past had returned. She sat down beside her daughter, and after a long silence played a single piece, a simple lullaby she had learned as a student. It was shaky, emotional, but it awakened something neither of them could fully explain. From that night on, Emily asked for more. More melodies, more memories, more music. And Sarah slowly and cautiously began to teach again, not from books or method, but from memory. They had no money for lessons, no teachers or tutors, just mother and daughter learning together, one string at a time, one note at a time. With patience and love, Emily began to play, and she played well, remarkably well. By 14, she could reproduce complex classical compositions by ear. Local teachers called her a prodigy, but Sarah refused to push her into competitions or public performances. It's not time, she'd say. For them, music wasn't about trophies. It was about healing. A quiet gift passed from one woman to the next, bridging a life that once ended to one just beginning. The restaurant buzzed with its usual energy that evening, the smell of truffle oil mixing with soft violin music from hidden speakers. Sarah moved through the dining room with practiced ease, balancing plates and polite smiles. What she didn't know was that tonight would be different. Tonight, someone would try to turn her daughter's quiet presence into a joke and fail spectacularly. Richard Langford had reserved the VIP room. A billionaire with too much power and too little grace, he came to Greenville twice a year, once for business, once for amusement. He was a man who spoke in commands and laughed at his own jokes before anyone else could. That night he sat with developers and partners, drinking expensive wine and surveying the room like he owned it. When he spotted Emily near the lobby holding her violin, he smirked. "Is that your daughter, Sarah?" he asked loudly. Sarah stiffened but nodded. "What's that she's carrying? A violin? Does she play anything other than dog waltzes?" Laughter erupted around the table. Sarah turned pale. Emily looked up uncertain. Then Langford made the mistake of challenging her. "Let's have some fun. Give us a concert," he said, tossing a $100 bill onto the table. The room went quiet. For a moment, Sarah tried to intervene, whispering, "You don't have to." But Emily stepped forward calmly. "I'll play," she said. She opened her worn case, revealing a violin more patched than polished. She took her stance not for show, not for applause. She closed her eyes and began. The first note was uncertain, fragile, like glass. But then came the music. Meditation from Thais. The same piece Sarah had once taught her in the quiet of their home. Only this time it didn't sound like a student repeating a lesson. It sounded like a young woman telling her story. The restaurant froze. Even the kitchen staff leaned in. Emily's bow danced like it was part of her body, pouring out sorrow, hope, defiance. It wasn't just performance. It was memory. It was truth. When the last note faded, the silence was almost painful. Then applause. First polite, then thunderous. And in the corner, a man with grey temples and soft eyes stood. He approached Sarah and said, "Miss Brennan, I'm Thomas Rain. I run a music academy in Boston. We need to talk about your daughter." Emily had played not just music, but something no one in the room expected herself. Langford clapped too reluctantly. His smile was tight. He didn't like losing control of a narrative. "Turns out your daughter is full of surprises," he said to Sarah, trying to regain authority. But it was too late. The room had chosen its star. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt something she thought she had lost forever: pride and the beginning of something new. The air still pulsed with the echo of Emily's final note as the applause filled every inch of the glass room. It wasn't the polite kind reserved for party tricks or background ambiance. This was different, genuine, stunned, reverent. Waiters stood frozen wine bottles, uncorked mid-pour. A chef leaned out from the kitchen, eyes wide. For a moment, Greenville, New York wasn't just a quiet town, it was the birthplace of something remarkable. From the shadows stepped a man who hadn't clapped the loudest, but whose eyes hadn't left Emily the entire time. He wore a simple grey jacket, his salt and pepper hair swept back, and his presence calm, yet intentional. He moved toward Sarah, who was still standing in silent awe, tears barely held back. "Miss Brennan," he said gently, "forgive the interruption. My name is Thomas Rain. I run a music academy in Boston." Sarah blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Thomas continued, "I've worked with gifted young musicians for over 2 decades. What your daughter just did, it wasn't talent. It was something rarer. It was truth. I'd like to speak with you about her future, if that's all right." He offered no business card, no grand promises. Just sincerity, and Sarah, a woman well-versed in reading people, saw no games in his eyes. At the table, Langford watched the exchange unfold. At first, he said nothing. His glass of wine hung in mid-air, forgotten. But as Rain finished his introduction, something shifted behind Langford's eyes. It wasn't admiration, it was calculation. He had invited Emily as a joke. But now, with a producer showing interest and a room hanging on her every note, she wasn't just a waitress's daughter anymore. She was a potential asset. Langford cleared his throat and stood. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "turns out we've been dining with a young prodigy." He approached Sarah and Rain slowly, the charm in his voice suddenly more deliberate. "Mr. Rain, is it? I'm always glad when real opportunity walks into the room. Sarah, you must be proud." His words sounded warm, but his tone curled at the edges. Thomas nodded politely. "Pride isn't the word I'd use," he replied. "She's something else entirely." Langford's eyes narrowed. In his world, assets didn't walk away. They were bought, shaped, leveraged. And now someone else had spotted what he failed to see until it was nearly too late. The next day, Langford returned to the glassroom not as a guest, but as a man with a mission. He waited until the evening after most patrons had left and approached Sarah while she was folding linens in the back corner. "Sarah," he began, voice low and confident, "let's speak frankly. I understand you're considering Mr. Rain's offer. But have you considered all your options?" Sarah looked up wary. Langford didn't wait for a response. "I can provide more than any scholarship ever could. A new violin, the best tutors, exclusive concerts, even a path to global stages. Imagine what Emily could do with proper backing, real money, real visibility." He leaned closer. "All she needs is guidance and loyalty." Sarah's expression hardened. "And whose guidance would that be?" she asked. Langford smiled faintly. "Someone who knows how to turn potential into power." It was all said so smoothly, but underneath Sarah heard the offer for what it truly was, a leash wrapped in silk. Her jaw tensed. "Mr. Langford, Emily is not a project. She's not a venture to be funded." He chuckled. "Don't be naive. Everyone needs backing. Everyone has a price." At that moment, Emily stepped into the room, violin case still slung across her shoulder. She had heard enough. Standing tall, she looked Langford directly in the eyes and said with quiet, unmistakable firmness, "We're not for sale." Langford blinked. The words weren't shouted, but they hit like a drumbeat. Something unspoken shifted in the air. Emily wasn't defiant. She was resolute. And Sarah, standing beside her, felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of power not built on wealth, but on will. For the first time, Langford seemed unsure. He looked at Emily not as a child, but as a threat to the way he did business. The meeting ended not with a deal, but with silence. As he walked away, Sarah realized that what had just happened wasn't a conversation, it was a battle, and her daughter had won. Later that night, the apartment was dim except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. Sarah sat alone at the table, a photo album open before her. The images were faded her, as a young music student, a rehearsal hall, a stage, a blurry photo of a boy with a violin smiling beside her. They were pieces of a life left behind, fragments of a dream paused but never forgotten. She traced her finger over a picture of herself at 19, standing in front of the Manhattan School of Music. So much hope in that young face, so much fire. The weight of memory settled on her chest heavier than ever. She wasn't crying, but her heart ached, not from regret, but from the fear of letting go again. This time it wasn't about her dream. It was about Emily's. Emily entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She placed one beside her mother and sat down. "Is that you?" she asked, pointing to the photo. Sarah nodded. "It was the year before I found out I was pregnant." Emily looked at it for a long time. "You looked fearless." Sarah smiled. "I wasn't. I just hadn't learned what fear felt like yet." There was a pause before Emily said, "Do you think I'm ready?" Sarah looked at her daughter, truly looked, and saw a young woman standing at the edge of something enormous. Yes, she whispered. But I'm terrified. Emily reached for her hand. Then let's be scared together. But let me go anyway. They sat in silence, their hands intertwined. Sarah knew she couldn't protect Emily from what lay ahead, but she could give her permission. Permission to leap. Permission to become. And as the night wore on, she finally understood letting go wasn't abandonment, it was love. 3 days later, without any announcement or fanfare, Emily showed up at the glass room. It was just past 7, and the restaurant was already filling with guests. Sarah, surprised to see her backstage with the violin in hand, asked softly, "What's going on?" Emily simply replied, "I feel like I need to be here." Her voice carried a calm weight, as if she already knew what would happen next. Langford was dining again that night, this time surrounded by clients and champagne. The mood was jovial, loud and careless. When he spotted Emily across the room, he grinned. "Well, look who's back. Is there a concert tonight?" he asked, raising his glass. Emily didn't respond with words. She stepped forward, lifted the violin, and nodded to the waiter to turn off the background music. Silence fell like a curtain. This time, she didn't play a classic. She played something of her own, a raw, intimate composition inspired by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but rewritten in her voice. It was imperfect, not polished like her last performance, but it was honest. The notes came in waves, fragile at first, then bold, then trembling with emotion. She wasn't trying to please anyone. She was announcing who she was. The audience didn't applaud immediately. They held their breath, wrapped in the vulnerability of the piece. When the final note faded, there was a long pause, then the first clap, hesitant. Then more. Then the entire room erupted. Someone stood. Someone whistled. It wasn't admiration this time, it was connection. Even Langford clapped, but he didn't smile. He couldn't. He knew this was no longer his stage. Thomas Raine, seated discreetly in the corner, rose and approached Emily. He didn't offer compliments. He simply extended his hand and said, "There's no choice now. You must go. Not for me, for the music. You owe it that much." Emily nodded quietly. Her mother, standing nearby, gave a small, proud smile. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about revenge. It was about expression, about a girl who refused to be defined by expectations and instead carved out a space where she belonged. Her music wasn't for decoration. It was for declaration. The following morning, Sarah sat with Thomas Raine at the now empty restaurant. Papers spread across the table like scattered notes on a piano. Raine had come prepared. Official scholarship documents, housing arrangements, course schedules. There were no strings, no hidden agendas. Only an invitation to step into a different world, a world where talent wasn't mocked but nurtured. Emily entered midway through the conversation. She didn't need persuasion. She had already made her decision the night before, long before the applause. She looked at the forms, then at Raine, then at her mother. "I'll go," she said simply. And with those words, something irreversible began. Sarah didn't cry. Not yet. But she felt the shift like the moment music moves from one movement into the next. Langford, ever persistent, made one last attempt. He called Sarah personally that evening. "She's being noticed now," he said. "That makes her valuable. Let me offer her a real future contracts agent's recordings." Sarah listened, then calmly replied, "She's already chosen. And it's not with you." Langford didn't argue. He hung up without a goodbye. For once, he understood that no amount of power could unmake a decision rooted in truth. Emily wasn't just going to Boston. She was leaving behind the world that tried to box her in and claiming the one that allowed her to grow wings. That night, Sarah watched her daughter pack. One small suitcase, one worn violin case, a letter folded neatly on the nightstand, one Sarah had written but couldn't bring herself to read aloud. Emily hugged her tightly and said, "Everything will be fine." And for once, Sarah believed it. Outside, the streets of Greenville looked the same. But for Sarah and Emily, the world had shifted. A door had opened, not one of luxury or control, but of purpose. And this time they were walking through it on their own terms. The night before Emily's departure felt like a quiet rehearsal for something neither of them was fully prepared to perform. The apartment was unusually still. No soft melodies from the bedroom, no clinking dishes in the kitchen. Just silence that carried the weight of an ending and a beginning all at once. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea, a pen in her hand, and a blank sheet of paper that stared back like a mirror. She tried to speak the words she'd been rehearsing in her heart for days, but they wouldn't come out. So instead she wrote. Her handwriting trembled as she poured her fears and hopes into ink. She wrote, not like a mother giving advice, but like a woman handing her life over to someone she had raised with her whole heart. She wrote about strength, about music, about truth. She reminded Emily that courage wasn't always loud, and that sometimes the quietest steps led to the loudest legacies. The letter wasn't long, but it was everything Sarah couldn't bring herself to say aloud. She folded it carefully and tucked it into Emily's violin case. At the airport the next morning, Emily sat by the large windows, the letter now open in her lap. Her hands trembled slightly as she read, not from fear, but from the weight of her mother's voice echoing through every line. You may look calm, but I know you. There's a storm inside you, it read. But don't be afraid of the wind. It's how wings learn to fly. The tears came softly. She didn't wipe them away. They felt honest. Her suitcase was small, just enough clothes for the coming months, and a few photos folded in a side pocket. Beside it sat her old violin case, worn but proud. Everything she was bringing with her to this new life fit into 2 hands. But it wasn't the luggage that mattered. It was the love that packed it. It was her mother's voice stitched into the seams of everything she carried. When the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Emily stood up slowly. She looked out one last time at the morning sky above Greenville and whispered a soft thank you to the place, to the pain, to the past. Then, with her back straight and her steps steady, she walked toward the gate. This wasn't just a journey to a music school. It was a crossing, from girlhood to womanhood, from silence to symphony. And somewhere in a kitchen flooded with morning light, Sarah sat with a half-empty coffee cup, trying not to cry. She didn't need to be at the airport to know her daughter had taken off. She could feel it. Letting go didn't mean losing her. It meant making space for both of them to rise. Ryan Academy was nothing like Greenville. The halls echoed with the hum of grand pianos, the rustle of sheet music, and the quiet urgency of young artists trying to find their place in a world of discipline and excellence. Emily arrived as a stranger, not just to the city or the school, but to herself. For the first time, she wasn't the only one who could play by ear, who could pull emotion from a string. Everyone around her was talented. Everyone around her had been trained. Emily had only heart. The first few weeks were the hardest. She struggled with structure, with technique, with fitting herself into forms she had never been taught to follow. Her teacher, Professor Vincent, was a man of few words but sharp eyes. After her first solo lesson, he said simply, "You lack form, but you hear things others don't." It wasn't a compliment. It was a challenge. Emily took it personally. And so she began to practice. 6, sometimes 7 hours a day. Her fingers bled, her confidence cracked, but she kept playing. Late at night, long after curfew, she would sit by the window with her old violin, not the new one gifted by the school, and play the melody her mother once taught her just to remember why she was there. Slowly, the fog began to lift. Her tone sharpened, her technique refined. But more importantly, she learned to blend structure with soul, to speak a language that didn't choose between beauty and honesty. When the Academy announced the winter concert, Emily's name appeared last on the program. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then she realized Rain had chosen her to close the evening. It was a test and a gift. She stepped onto the stage in a simple black dress, her hands steady but her heart racing. In the audience sat teachers, critics, producers, and none of them knew her story. She began with a melody that was never written down. It was hers, but inside it was a thread, faint but present, of her mother's lullaby. The piece grew into something complex, symphonic, but it always returned to that original theme. By the time she reached the final note, the room was silent, still holding its breath. Then, slowly, the audience rose. Not because she had impressed them, but because she had moved them. In that moment, it wasn't about perfection or pedigree. It was about presence. Emily hadn't just played music. She had offered herself raw, flawed whole, and the world for the first time had truly listened. 2 weeks later, a small article appeared in a national music journal. The headline read, "Emily Brennan, the violinist who made the room stand still." But it was the subtitle that mattered most. My first teacher was named Sarah. She was a waitress, and she taught me to hear music, not just play it. It was a quote that didn't fit the image of a rising star, and that's why it mattered. Back in Greenville, Sarah sat in a modest cafe, sipping coffee during a rare quiet moment between shifts at the Children's Music Club, where she now volunteered. She didn't expect to see her own name in print, but when she did, she couldn't hold back the tears. The waitress beside her asked if she was okay. Sarah smiled, shook her head, and said through the lump in her throat, "Yes, it's just happiness." The town had moved on in many ways. The glass room had changed owners. Langford no longer visited. Officially, he had stepped back from business, though no one missed him. In Greenville, memories faded quickly, except for those tied to heart. And while the town had forgotten the man who once tried to own everything, it was beginning to remember the girl who gave it something real. Emily's performances became more frequent. Her name appeared not because of marketing or scandal, but because people felt something when she played. They heard honesty. They heard history. They heard home. Sarah, who once feared her daughter would disappear into a world too big to understand her, now saw her embraced by it, not for who people expected her to be, but for who she truly was. One evening, a local boy began playing piano in the restaurant where Sarah used to work. He stumbled over the keys, awkward but sincere. Sarah, sitting in the corner with a cup of tea, watched quietly and smiled. Once she had been that child, then her daughter. Now someone new. The music had never stopped. It had just passed from hand to hand like a candle lighting the next. Legacy isn't always carved in stone or cast in spotlight. Sometimes it's written in a single sentence in a magazine. Sometimes it's a note in a melody no one else can play. And sometimes it's the simple truth that even a waitress can change the world if she dares to raise a musician with her heart.